Miss Dorothy, an evil teacher, humiliates a 7-year-old black boy named Kennedy in front of his classmates, unaware that his father is the new school principal. Can she undo the damage, or has she crossed a line? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Miss Dorothy's classroom was a place where laughter and joy seemed to vanish the moment you stepped through the door. The walls were bare, save for a few stern-looking posters about rules and good behavior. The air felt heavy like a blanket that smothered any spark of creativity or fun. As the children filed in, their usual chatter died down to hushed whispers. Miss Dorothy stood at the front, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk searching for prey. She was tall and thin, with brown hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. "Sit down and be quiet," she snapped, her voice as sharp as a whip. The kids scrambled to their seats, their eyes wide with fear. In the back of the room, little Kennedy Whitmore tried to make himself as small as possible. He was new to the school, and at only 7 years old, he found Miss Dorothy terrifying. His dark skin stood out in the mostly white classroom, making him feel even more alone. Kennedy's desk was messy, and he frantically tried to straighten his papers before Miss Dorothy noticed. But it was too late. "Kennedy Whitmore," Miss Dorothy's voice boomed across the room. "What did I say about keeping your desk tidy?" Kennedy's lower lip trembled. I'm sorry, Miss Dorothy. I was just trying to—" "No excuses," she cut him off. "Come up here and show the class how to properly organize your desk." Kennedy's legs felt like jelly as he walked to the front of the room. His classmates watched with sympathy in their eyes, but no one dared to speak up. They knew better than to challenge Miss Dorothy. As Kennedy fumbled with his papers, his hands shaking, Miss Dorothy's frown deepened. "Hurry up, boy. We don't have all day." Tears welled up in Kennedy's eyes, but he blinked them back. He didn't want to cry in front of everyone. He just wanted to do well, to make his new dad proud. But no matter how hard he tried, it never seemed to be enough for Miss Dorothy. When Kennedy finally finished, Miss Dorothy dismissed him with a curt nod. As he walked back to his seat, he caught the eye of his friend, Sarah. She gave him a small, encouraging smile, but quickly looked away when Miss Dorothy glared in their direction. The rest of the morning dragged on, with Miss Dorothy's harsh voice filling the air. Every mistake was met with criticism, every question with impatience. The children sat stiffly in their chairs, too afraid to move or speak unless called upon. For Kennedy, each minute felt like an hour. He tried his best to follow the rules, to sit up straight and pay attention. But Miss Dorothy always seemed to find something wrong. His handwriting wasn't neat enough. He was too slow to answer questions. He fidgeted too much in his seat. By lunchtime, Kennedy's shoulders sagged with the weight of Miss Dorothy's disapproval. As the children lined up to leave the classroom, he hung back, not wanting to risk another scolding for being out of line. The next morning, Principal Bernard Whitmore stood at the entrance of Oakwood Elementary, greeting students with a warm smile as they arrived for the day. His tall, lean figure and kind eyes made him an approachable presence, and the children's faces lit up as they passed by him. "Good morning, Principal Whitmore," a group of third graders chorused. "Good morning, kids." "Have a wonderful day," Bernard replied, his deep voice filled with genuine warmth. As he watched the stream of students, Bernard's heart swelled with pride when he spotted a familiar face in the crowd. Kennedy, his newly adopted son, was walking towards the school, his backpack almost as big as he was. "There's my boy," Bernard said softly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Kennedy looked up and saw his dad. For a moment, his shy demeanor melted away, replaced by a bright smile that lit up his whole face. He quickened his pace, nearly running the last few steps. "Dad!" Kennedy exclaimed, wrapping his arms around Bernard's waist. Bernard knelt down, meeting Kennedy at eye level. "Hey, champ, ready for another day?" Kennedy's smile faltered a bit. "I guess so," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Bernard's heart ached at the uncertainty in his son's voice. He knew Kennedy was still adjusting to his new life, new family, new school, new everything. It wasn't easy, but Bernard was determined to help Kennedy feel safe and loved. "You're going to do great," Bernard assured him, giving Kennedy's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Remember what we talked about? Just be yourself and do your best. That's all that matters." Kennedy nodded, drawing strength from his father's words. "Okay, Dad. I'll try." As Kennedy headed into the school, Bernard watched him go with a mixture of love and concern. He wanted so badly for Kennedy to thrive here, to find his place and shine. The boy was smart and kind-hearted, with so much potential. Bernard knew that with the right support and encouragement, Kennedy could accomplish anything. Throughout the day, Bernard found himself thinking about Kennedy. Between meetings and paperwork, he'd glance at the family photo on his desk, a snapshot of the two of them at the park, both grinning widely. It had been taken just days after the adoption was finalized, and the joy in their faces was palpable. Bernard's secretary, Mrs. Thompson, noticed his distraction. "Everything all right, Principal Whitmore?" she asked. Bernard smiled. "Just thinking about Kennedy, it's been a big change for him, you know. I want to make sure he's settling in okay." Mrs. Thompson nodded understandingly. "He's lucky to have you. I'm sure he'll adjust in no time." "I hope so," Bernard replied, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I just want him to know he's loved and supported, no matter what." As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Bernard made his way to the front entrance again. He watched as students poured out of the building, chattering excitedly about their day. His eyes scanned the crowd, looking for Kennedy. As the students settled into their seats for the afternoon reading session, Miss Dorothy's stern gaze swept across the classroom. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she adjusted her glasses, preparing to call on students for the day's exercise. "Kennedy," she said sharply, causing the boy to jump slightly in his chair. "Read the first paragraph on page 37, please." Kennedy's small hands trembled as he opened his book. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, and began to read aloud. The big brown D-dog," he started, his voice barely audible. "Speak up," Miss Dorothy snapped. "We can't hear you mumbling back there." Kennedy flinched at her harsh tone but tried again, raising his voice slightly. "The big brown dog ran across the—" He paused, stumbling over an unfamiliar word. Miss Dorothy's impatience was palpable. "Well?" "We're waiting, Kennedy." Meadow?" Kennedy guessed, his voice quivering with uncertainty. Miss Dorothy's face darkened. "It's Meadow, you foolish boy. How many times do we have to go over this?" She strode to Kennedy's desk, snatching the book from his hands. "This is third-grade material, and you can barely read it. Are you even trying, or are you just lazy?" Tears welled up in Kennedy's eyes as he shrank back in his seat. The other students watched in uncomfortable silence, some averting their eyes, others exchanging worried glances. I'm sorry," Kennedy whispered, his lower lip trembling. "Sorry doesn't cut it," Miss Dorothy continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "At this rate, you'll never catch up. You're hopeless." The cruel words hung in the air, and Kennedy couldn't hold back his tears any longer. They streamed down his face as he buried his head in his arms on the desk, his small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The classroom was eerily quiet. No one dared to move or speak. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife as Miss Dorothy glared at Kennedy's hunched form. Some of Kennedy's classmates looked at each other, their faces a mix of shock and sympathy. A few seemed on the verge of speaking up, but fear of Miss Dorothy's wrath kept them silent. The normally cheerful atmosphere of the classroom had been replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. Kennedy's spirits, once buoyed by his father's morning encouragement, now lay in shattered pieces around him. The cruel words echoed in his mind, reinforcing his deepest fears about not being good enough, not belonging. In that moment, all the progress he had made in adjusting to his new life seemed to crumble away, leaving him feeling more alone than ever. As the afternoon sun filtered through the classroom windows, Principal Bernard Whitmore made his way down the hallway. He had a few spare moments and decided to pay an unexpected visit to Kennedy's class. A small smile played on his lips as he thought about surprising his son with his presence. Approaching the classroom, Bernard slowed his steps, not wanting to disrupt the lesson. He reached the doorway and peered inside, his eyes immediately drawn to Kennedy's small form hunched over his desk. What Bernard saw next made his heart sink. Miss Dorothy loomed over Kennedy, her face contorted with anger as she berated him. The words lazy and hopeless reached Bernard's ears, each one feeling like a physical blow. Bernard's hand tightened on the doorframe, his knuckles turning white. He watched in stunned silence as tears streamed down Kennedy's face, the boy's shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The other students sat frozen in their seats, eyes wide with fear and discomfort. A surge of protective anger welled up inside Bernard. Every fiber of his being wanted to rush into the room and put an end to this cruel display. But years of experience as an educator kicked in, reminding him of the delicate balance required in such situations. Taking a deep breath, Bernard forced himself to remain calm. He knew that bursting in now would only escalate the situation and potentially embarrass Kennedy further. As much as it pained him to see his son suffering, Bernard recognized the need for a more measured approach. Quietly, he stepped back from the doorway, his mind racing. He needed to address this immediately, but in a way that would bring about lasting change. Bernard's thoughts turned to the school's policies on classroom conduct and teacher evaluations. There had to be a way to use these tools to ensure this kind of behavior wouldn't continue. As he walked back to his office, Bernard's heart ached for Kennedy. He longed to rush back and comfort his son, to tell him how proud he was of him. But Bernard knew that the most loving thing he could do right now was to handle this situation carefully and strategically. Sitting at his desk, Bernard began to formulate a plan. He would need to document what he had witnessed, consult with the school board, and carefully consider the next steps. This wasn't just about Kennedy anymore. It was about ensuring a safe and nurturing environment for all students. Bernard's resolve strengthened as he thought about the trust placed in him, both as a principal and as a father. He would not let Kennedy or any other child down. With determination in his eyes, Bernard reached for his phone, ready to set his plan in motion. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Miss Dorothy gathered her belongings and made her way to Principal Whitmore's office. She walked with a confident stride, her head held high, expecting nothing more than a routine conversation with the new principal. Reaching the office door, she knocked briskly and entered when she heard Bernard's calm, "Come in." Miss Dorothy settled into the chair across from him, her posture rigid and her expression neutral. "Thank you for coming, Miss Dorothy," Bernard began, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. "I wanted to discuss today's events in your classroom. How did the day go?" Miss Dorothy's lips curled into a small smile. "It was a productive day, Principal Whitmore. The children are making progress, though some require more encouragement than others." Bernard leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Miss Dorothy's face. "I see. And how do you typically provide that encouragement?" "I have high standards, Principal Whitmore," Miss Dorothy replied, her tone becoming slightly defensive. "I believe in pushing the students to reach their full potential. Some may find my methods strict, but they're necessary for success." Bernard nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "And how would you say Kennedy is doing in your class?" At the mention of Kennedy's name, Miss Dorothy's posture stiffened even more. "Kennedy. Well, he struggles more than most. I'm afraid he's not keeping up with the rest of the class. He needs to be pushed harder if he's going to succeed." "Pushed harder?" Bernard echoed, his voice carefully controlled. "Can you elaborate on that? How exactly do you push Kennedy to succeed?" Miss Dorothy's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing a shift in the conversation. "I don't coddle him, if that's what you're asking. He needs to learn that the world won't make exceptions for him. I point out his mistakes so he can correct them and do better." "I see," Bernard said, his tone neutral. "And do you believe that calling a student lazy or hopeless is an effective teaching method?" Miss Dorothy's face paled slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "Principal Whitmore, I assure you that any words I use are meant to motivate the students. Sometimes they need a firm hand to guide them." Bernard leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Miss Dorothy, I want you to know that I value honesty and transparency in this school. Is there anything else you'd like to share about your interactions with the students, particularly Kennedy?" Miss Dorothy's face paled further, her eyes widening as she realized the implications of Bernard's question. She stammered, trying to find the right words to defend herself. I assure you, Principal Whitmore, my methods are strictly professional. I treat all students equally, she said, her voice wavering slightly. Bernard took a deep breath, his calm demeanor masking the turmoil within. Miss Dorothy, there's something you should know, he said softly. Kennedy is my adopted son. The words hung in the air like a heavy curtain. Miss Dorothy's mouth fell open, her face a picture of shock and horror. She felt as if the ground had suddenly disappeared beneath her feet. Your son? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Bernard nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. Yes, my son. And I witnessed your interaction with him today. Miss Dorothy's mind raced, desperately trying to process this new information. She had humiliated the principal's child, and he had seen it all. Her hands began to tremble as she gripped the arms of her chair. Principal Whitmore, I had no idea, she stammered, her earlier confidence evaporating. You must understand, I never meant to. She paused, realizing her mistake in admitting any wrongdoing. Quickly, she tried to backtrack. What I mean is, my treatment of Kennedy was not malicious. I simply have high expectations for all my students. Bernard listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When Miss Dorothy finished speaking, he leaned forward, his voice firm but controlled. I appreciate your explanation, Miss Dorothy. However, I cannot condone any behavior that demeans or discourages our students, regardless of who they are or who their parents might be. Miss Dorothy nodded frantically, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Of course. I completely understand. I assure you, it won't happen again. Bernard stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Thank you for your time, Miss Dorothy. We'll continue this discussion later. For now, please reflect on our conversation and consider how we can create a more positive learning environment for all our students. Miss Dorothy rose shakily to her feet, her legs feeling weak beneath her. She mumbled a quick, "Thank you," and hurried towards the door, her mind reeling from the unexpected turn of events. As she exited the office, Miss Dorothy felt utterly unsettled. The weight of her actions and their potential consequences pressed heavily on her shoulders. She walked down the empty hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silence, wondering what would happen next. Kennedy trudged up the driveway, his small shoulders slumped under the weight of his backpack. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn, mirroring the dark cloud that seemed to hover over the little boy. As he reached for the doorknob, it swung open, revealing Bernard's warm, welcoming smile. "Hey there, champ," Bernard greeted, his voice filled with love. "How was your day?" Kennedy's eyes dropped to the ground, his lower lip quivering slightly. "It was okay," he mumbled, stepping inside. Bernard's heart ached as he watched his son shuffle past. He gently closed the door and followed Kennedy to the living room, where the boy plopped down on the couch, hugging a throw pillow to his chest. "You know, Kennedy," Bernard said softly, sitting beside him, "it's okay if your day wasn't great. We all have tough days sometimes." Kennedy looked up at his father, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Miss Dorothy said I was lazy and hopeless," he whispered, his voice cracking. Bernard felt a surge of anger at Miss Dorothy's cruel words, but he kept his expression calm and loving. He wrapped an arm around Kennedy's shoulders, pulling him close. "Oh, buddy," he sighed, "I'm so sorry you had to hear that, but I want you to know something very important." He gently tilted Kennedy's chin up, meeting his gaze. "You are not lazy, and you are certainly not hopeless. You are smart, kind, and so very loved." A single tear rolled down Kennedy's cheek. "Really?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. "Really," Bernard affirmed, wiping away the tear with his thumb. "No matter what happens at school or anywhere else, you will always be loved and valued here at home. I'm so proud to be your dad, Kennedy." Kennedy's lips quivered into a small smile, and he leaned into his father's embrace. They sat there for a while, Bernard's steady presence a comforting anchor for the troubled boy. "How about we make your favorite dinner tonight?" Bernard suggested, ruffling Kennedy's hair. "Spaghetti and meatballs sound good?" Kennedy nodded, his smile growing a little wider. "Can I help?" "Of course," Bernard chuckled. "I need my top chef assistant, after all." As they moved to the kitchen together, Bernard noticed that while Kennedy seemed more relaxed, there was still a hint of hesitation in his eyes. He knew his son might not be ready to share everything he was feeling just yet, but he was determined to be there whenever Kennedy was ready to open up. The next morning, Miss Dorothy arrived at school earlier than usual, her steps quick and nervous as she made her way to her classroom. Her hands trembled slightly as she unlocked the door, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting Principal Bernard to appear at any moment. As she settled at her desk, Miss Dorothy's mind raced with worry. What if Bernard decided to fire her? How could she have known Kennedy was his son? She took a deep breath, trying to calm her frayed nerves. When the students began to file in, Miss Dorothy's eyes immediately found Kennedy. The boy seemed smaller somehow, more withdrawn. She felt a pang of guilt, quickly followed by a surge of defensiveness. She had to maintain her authority after all. "Good morning, class," she said, her voice clipped and cold. "Take your seats quietly, please." As the lesson began, Miss Dorothy found herself hyper-aware of every interaction with Kennedy. She avoided calling on him, her gaze skipping over his raised hand. When she did have to address him, her tone was brusque and impersonal. "Kennedy, please read the next paragraph," she instructed, her voice devoid of warmth. Kennedy stood, his voice barely above a whisper as he stumbled through the text. Miss Dorothy's fingers tightened around her pen, her frustration mounting. "Speak up, Kennedy," she snapped. "We can't hear you when you mumble like that." Kennedy's shoulders hunched as he tried to read louder, his words still halting and uncertain. Miss Dorothy's irritation grew with each stumbled syllable. "That's enough," she said sharply, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Sit down. Sarah, you finish the paragraph." As Kennedy sank into his seat, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, Miss Dorothy felt a mix of guilt and justification. She had to maintain standards, didn't she? Meanwhile, in his office, Bernard sat reviewing reports, his mind partially occupied with the situation in Miss Dorothy's classroom. He had instructed other teachers and staff to keep a discreet eye on the interactions between Miss Dorothy and Kennedy, providing him with regular updates. As he read through the latest observations, Bernard's brow furrowed with concern. It was clear that Miss Dorothy's behavior toward Kennedy had shifted, becoming colder and more distant. Yet, there was also an underlying current of anxiety in her actions, a nervousness that seemed to be affecting her entire demeanor in the classroom. Bernard leaned back in his chair, considering his next move carefully. He knew he couldn't rush into action without fully understanding the situation. Hasty decisions could potentially make things worse for Kennedy and the other students. As the days passed, Miss Dorothy's paranoia grew like a thorny vine, wrapping itself around her thoughts and actions. Every time she caught a glimpse of Principal Bernard in the hallway or saw him talking with other teachers, her heart raced. She convinced herself that he was watching her every move, waiting for her to make a mistake. In her classroom, Miss Dorothy's behavior became increasingly erratic. She'd snap at students for the smallest infractions, her voice sharp and eyes darting nervously around the room. But it was Kennedy who bore the brunt of her anxiety-fueled hostility. "Kennedy," she called out one morning, her tone cold and clipped. "Come to the board and solve this math problem." Kennedy hesitated, his small frame seeming to shrink even further as he slowly made his way to the front of the class. His hand shook as he picked up the chalk, and he stared at the problem, his mind going blank with fear. "Well?" Miss Dorothy prompted impatiently. "We're waiting." Kennedy's lip trembled as he tried to focus on the numbers, but they swam before his eyes. He could feel the weight of his classmates' stares, could almost hear their silent pity. I don't know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Miss Dorothy's lips thinned into a hard line. "Of course you don't," she said, her words dripping with disdain. "Sit down, Kennedy. Maybe if you paid more attention in class instead of daydreaming, you'd be able to keep up with your peers." As Kennedy shuffled back to his seat, head bowed and cheeks burning with shame, Miss Dorothy felt a twinge of guilt. But she quickly pushed it aside, justifying her actions to herself. She had to maintain high standards, didn't she? It wasn't her fault if some students couldn't meet them. Yet even as she tried to convince herself of her righteousness, a part of her knew she was wrong. She saw how Kennedy withdrew more each day, how he no longer raised his hand to answer questions or participated in class discussions. His once bright eyes now seemed dull and lifeless, filled with a fear that broke through even Miss Dorothy's hardened exterior. But admitting her mistake would mean facing the consequences of her actions, and that thought terrified her more than anything. So she continued on her path, her treatment of Kennedy growing colder by the day, while her paranoia about Bernard's watchful eye intensified. Miss Rodriguez, a kind-hearted teacher with warm brown eyes and a gentle smile, couldn't help but notice Kennedy's growing distress in the school hallways. Her heart ached for the young boy who seemed to shrink into himself with each passing day. One afternoon, as Kennedy trudged out of Miss Dorothy's classroom with slumped shoulders, Miss Rodriguez approached him. "Hi there, Kennedy," she said softly. "How are you doing today?" Kennedy looked up, surprised by the gentle tone. "I'm okay," he mumbled, not quite meeting her eyes. Miss Rodriguez knelt down to his level. "You know, it's all right if you're not feeling okay. Sometimes school can be tough. Would you like to talk about it?" Kennedy hesitated, then gave a small nod. Miss Rodriguez guided him to a quiet corner of the hallway, where they sat on a bench together. "I can't do anything right," Kennedy whispered, his voice trembling. "Miss Dorothy always says I'm not trying hard enough." Miss Rodriguez's heart broke for the little boy. "Oh, Kennedy," she said, her voice full of warmth. "You are trying. I can see how hard you work. Sometimes we all need a little extra help, and that's okay." From that day on, Miss Rodriguez made it her mission to support Kennedy. She'd offer him encouraging smiles in the hallway and sometimes stopped by Miss Dorothy's classroom to help out, always making sure to give Kennedy some positive attention. During lunch breaks, Miss Rodriguez invited Kennedy to her classroom, where she'd help him with his homework. She used colorful stickers and gentle praise to boost his confidence. "Look at how well you solved that problem, Kennedy," she'd exclaim, her eyes twinkling with pride. "You're making great progress." Slowly but surely, Kennedy began to blossom under Miss Rodriguez's care. His smiles, though still shy, became more frequent, and he started to participate more in class activities. However, Miss Dorothy didn't miss the change in Kennedy, or the reason behind it. She watched with narrowed eyes as Miss Rodriguez chatted with Kennedy in the hallway, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. One day, as Miss Rodriguez was leaving Miss Dorothy's classroom after helping out, Miss Dorothy called out to her. "Miss Rodriguez," she said, her voice clipped, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I must ask you not to coddle my students. They need to learn to stand on their own 2 feet." Miss Rodriguez paused, taken aback by Miss Dorothy's harsh tone. "I'm just trying to help, Miss Dorothy. Every child learns differently, and sometimes a little extra support can make all the difference." Miss Dorothy's eyes flashed with anger. "I've been teaching for longer than you've been alive, Miss Rodriguez. I think I know what's best for my students." As Miss Rodriguez walked away, she could feel Miss Dorothy's glare burning into her back. She knew she was treading on dangerous ground, but the thought of Kennedy's growing smile gave her the courage to continue her support, no matter the consequences. Bernard Whitmore sat in his office, his brow furrowed in concentration. The weight of Kennedy's sadness and Miss Dorothy's harsh treatment weighed heavily on his heart. As a father, he wanted to protect his son. As a principal, he knew he had to approach this delicate situation with care and fairness. With a deep sigh, Bernard picked up his phone and dialed the number of Mrs. Johnson, a parent who had expressed concerns about Miss Dorothy in the past. "Mrs. Johnson, this is Principal Whitmore. I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said, his voice warm but serious. "Not at all, Principal Whitmore. Is everything okay?" Mrs. Johnson replied, concern evident in her tone. Bernard chose his words carefully. "I'm conducting a confidential inquiry into some concerns that have been raised about one of our teachers. I understand you've had some issues with Miss Dorothy in the past. Would you be willing to share your experiences with me?" As Mrs. Johnson recounted her story, Bernard listened intently, jotting down notes. His heart sank as he heard echoes of Kennedy's struggles in Mrs. Johnson's words. Over the next few days, Bernard discreetly reached out to other teachers and parents. He scheduled casual meetings in his office, careful not to raise suspicion. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle, painting a troubling picture of Miss Dorothy's behavior over the years. Mr. Wilson, a fellow teacher, spoke in hushed tones as he sat across from Bernard. "I've seen her single out certain students, Principal Whitmore. It's uncomfortable to watch. But she's been here so long, I wasn't sure if I should say anything." Bernard nodded, his face a mask of professional calm even as his heart raced with concern. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Wilson. Your input is valuable and will remain confidential." As Bernard built his case, he couldn't help but notice Miss Dorothy's growing unease. She seemed jumpier in the hallways, her eyes darting around suspiciously. During staff meetings, she sat rigid in her chair, her lips pressed into a thin line. One afternoon, as Bernard was leaving his office, he nearly bumped into Miss Dorothy. "Oh, Principal Whitmore," she exclaimed, her voice higher than usual. I was just wondering if everything is all right. The atmosphere seems different lately." Bernard offered a reassuring smile, careful not to reveal his ongoing investigation. "Everything's fine, Miss Dorothy. Just the usual end-of-term busyness. Is there anything you'd like to discuss?" Miss Dorothy hesitated, then shook her head. No. Everything's fine. Have a good day, Principal Whitmore." As she hurried away, Bernard watched her retreating figure with a mix of sadness and determination. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but for the sake of Kennedy and all the students, he had to ensure that justice and kindness prevailed in his school. As the days passed, a subtle change began to take root in Miss Dorothy's classroom. Kennedy, once withdrawn and fearful, started to show small signs of improvement in his classwork. His handwriting became neater, his answers more confident, and his participation in class discussions more frequent. Miss Rodriguez's gentle encouragement had sparked a flame of hope in Kennedy's heart. She would often stop by his desk, offering a kind word or a helpful tip. "You're doing great, Kennedy," she'd whisper, her warm smile lighting up his face. "Keep it up." Kennedy's classmates, inspired by Miss Rodriguez's kindness, began to rally around him too. During group activities, they made sure to include him, offering patient explanations when he struggled. At recess, they invited him to join their games, cheering loudly when he scored a goal in soccer. "Way to go, Kennedy!" his friend Tommy shouted, giving him a high five. Kennedy beamed, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. For the first time since joining the school, he felt like he truly belonged. Miss Dorothy, however, watched these changes with growing resentment. Her sharp eyes narrowed as she observed Kennedy's progress and the support he was receiving. She saw it as a direct challenge to her authority, a threat to the rigid order she had maintained in her classroom for years. One afternoon, as Kennedy correctly answered a difficult math problem, Miss Dorothy's lips tightened into a thin line. She grudgingly marked his answers were correct but couldn't bring herself to offer any praise. "Well, it seems someone has finally decided to put in some effort," she said coldly, her words dripping with sarcasm. Kennedy's smile faltered slightly, but he held his head high. He knew he had done well, and Miss Dorothy's words couldn't take that away from him. As the days went on, Kennedy's confidence grew. He began to raise his hand more often in class, his voice growing stronger with each correct answer. His homework assignments, once a source of anxiety, now brought him a sense of pride as he turned them in neatly completed. Miss Dorothy felt her control slipping away. The classroom she had ruled with an iron fist was changing, and she didn't like it one bit. She began to look for ways to reassert her authority, her eyes constantly scanning for any mistake Kennedy might make. The tension in the classroom was palpable. Students exchanged worried glances whenever Miss Dorothy's gaze lingered too long on Kennedy. They could sense the storm brewing, but they stood firm in their support of their friend. Kennedy, for his part, tried to focus on the positive changes in his life. He cherished the friendships he was building and the newfound joy he felt in learning. But even as his confidence grew, a small part of him remained wary, always aware of Miss Dorothy's cold, disapproving stare. As the days progressed, Miss Dorothy's frustration grew. She felt cornered, her authority slipping away with each small victory Kennedy achieved. Unable to accept the changes in her classroom, she decided to take matters into her own hands. During a spelling test, Miss Dorothy paced the room, her eyes fixed on Kennedy. When he hesitated over a word, she pounced. "Having trouble, Kennedy?" she asked loudly, her voice dripping with false concern. "Perhaps your recent improvements were just luck after all." Kennedy's cheeks burned as he hunched over his paper, trying to concentrate. His classmates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the unfairness of Miss Dorothy's words. In math class, when Kennedy volunteered an answer, Miss Dorothy's lips curled into a smirk. "Are you sure about that?" she questioned, even though his response was correct. "Maybe you should think a little harder before speaking up." These subtle jabs continued throughout the week. When Kennedy turned in a well-done project, Miss Dorothy barely glanced at it before setting it aside. "We'll see if it's actually up to standard," she muttered, loud enough for nearby students to hear. During reading time, Miss Dorothy called on Kennedy more frequently than others, often choosing the most difficult passages. When he stumbled over a word, she sighed heavily. "I thought we were past this, Kennedy. It seems your progress isn't as solid as some might believe." Kennedy tried to stay strong, reminding himself of how far he'd come. But Miss Dorothy's constant negativity began to wear him down. His shoulders slumped a little more each day, and the bright smile that had begun to emerge started to fade. His friends noticed the change. "Don't listen to her, Kennedy," Tommy whispered during lunch. "You're doing great." But the strain was showing. Kennedy's hand trembled slightly as he raised it in class, and he second-guessed his answers more often. The confidence he had built began to waver under Miss Dorothy's relentless pressure. Miss Rodriguez watched this unfold with growing concern. She saw the light in Kennedy's eyes dimming and felt helpless to stop it. But she continued to offer him encouragement whenever she could, determined not to let Miss Dorothy's tactics succeed. As the days passed, the tension between Miss Dorothy and Kennedy became increasingly noticeable to the school staff. In the teacher's lounge, hushed conversations and concerned glances were exchanged as Miss Dorothy's behavior towards the young boy became more apparent. Miss Rodriguez sat at a small table, stirring her coffee absently as she listened to her colleagues discuss the situation. "I've never seen Miss Dorothy act this way before," whispered Mrs. Johnson, a third-grade teacher. "It's like she's got a vendetta against that poor child." Mr. Smith, the gym teacher, nodded in agreement. "I've noticed Kennedy's becoming more withdrawn during PE. He used to love playing with the other kids, but now he just stands off to the side." Miss Rodriguez's grip tightened on her mug. She had seen the changes in Kennedy too, and it broke her heart. The bright, eager boy she had come to know was slowly disappearing, replaced by a quiet, hesitant child who seemed afraid of his own shadow. "We need to do something," Miss Rodriguez said, her voice low but firm. "We can't just stand by and watch this happen." The other teachers looked at her, a mix of agreement and uncertainty on their faces. They all knew the delicate nature of the situation, especially given Miss Dorothy's long tenure at the school. "But what can we do?" asked Mrs. Johnson. "Miss Dorothy's been here for years. It's not like we can just report her without solid evidence." Miss Rodriguez stood up, her resolve strengthening. "We can start by documenting what we see, and more importantly, we can be there for Kennedy. He needs to know he's not alone in this." As the group nodded in agreement, Miss Rodriguez felt a fierce protectiveness wash over her. She made a silent vow to herself to shield Kennedy from Miss Dorothy's harmful behavior, no matter what it took. Over the next few days, Miss Rodriguez made it a point to check in on Kennedy more frequently. She'd stop by Miss Dorothy's classroom during her free periods, offering to help with group activities, or simply observing from the doorway. Each time she saw Miss Dorothy's cold glare directed at Kennedy, Miss Rodriguez felt her determination grow. During recess, she made sure to be on duty in the playground where Kennedy's class played. She watched as he slowly began to join in games again, encouraged by her gentle smiles and words of support. "You're doing great, Kennedy," she said softly one day, as he hesitantly approached a group of kids playing jump rope. "Remember, you belong here just as much as anyone else." Kennedy looked up at her, a small spark of his old self shining through. "Thanks, Miss Rodriguez," he whispered, before running off to join his classmates. As Miss Rodriguez watched him play, she knew that this battle was far from over. But she was ready to fight for Kennedy, to be the shield he needed against Miss Dorothy's cruelty. She wouldn't let this bright, deserving child be dimmed by one teacher's prejudice and spite. As the weeks passed, Bernard's investigation into Miss Dorothy's behavior grew more intense. He meticulously documented every incident reported to him, creating a thick file of complaints and testimonies. Each new piece of evidence added to the weight on his shoulders, knowing that the situation was far more serious than he had initially thought. One afternoon, as Bernard sat in his office reviewing the latest reports, there was a knock at his door. It was Mrs. Thompson, a parent he had spoken to earlier in the week. "Come in, Mrs. Thompson," Bernard said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Mrs. Thompson sat down, her face etched with worry. "Principal Whitmore, I wanted to follow up on our conversation about my daughter, Emily. Things have gotten worse." Bernard leaned forward, his brow furrowed with concern. "Can you tell me what's happened?" Mrs. Thompson's eyes welled up with tears. "Emily came home crying yesterday. She said Miss Dorothy called her stupid in front of the whole class when she couldn't solve a math problem. My little girl is afraid to go to school now." Bernard's heart sank. He reached for a tissue box and handed it to Mrs. Thompson. "I'm so sorry this happened to Emily. I want you to know that we're taking this very seriously." As Mrs. Thompson left his office, Bernard knew he couldn't delay any longer. He had to confront Miss Dorothy, but he needed to approach the situation carefully. The last thing he wanted was to make things worse for Kennedy or any of the other students. Bernard spent the next few days preparing his case. He organized all the evidence he had gathered, including parent complaints, staff observations, and even anonymous reports from students. The picture it painted was clear. Miss Dorothy's behavior was harmful and needed to be addressed. Despite the mounting pressure to act quickly, Bernard remained patient. He knew that rushing into a confrontation could backfire, potentially giving Miss Dorothy an opportunity to deny the allegations or retaliate against the students. He needed to be strategic, to ensure that when he finally confronted her, there would be no room for doubt or escape. As he worked late into the evening, Bernard's thoughts kept drifting to Kennedy. He could see the toll Miss Dorothy's treatment was taking on his son, and it broke his heart. But he knew that by handling this situation properly, he could protect not just Kennedy, but all the students under his care. With a heavy sigh, Bernard closed the file on his desk. He had made his decision. Tomorrow he would schedule a formal meeting with Miss Dorothy and the school board. It was time to put an end to her harmful behavior once and for all. The day of the class presentations arrived, and the air in Miss Dorothy's classroom was thick with anticipation. Kennedy sat at his desk, fidgeting nervously with the edges of his project board. He had worked tirelessly on this presentation for weeks, staying after school with Miss Rodriguez to perfect every detail. As Miss Dorothy called each student up to present, Kennedy's heart raced faster. He glanced over at Miss Rodriguez, who stood near the back of the room. She gave him an encouraging smile and a subtle thumbs up. "Kennedy Whitmore," Miss Dorothy's voice rang out sharp and cold. "You're next." With shaky hands, Kennedy picked up his project and made his way to the front of the class. He took a deep breath, just like Miss Rodriguez had taught him, and began to speak. "My project is about the solar system," Kennedy started, his voice barely above a whisper. But as he continued, his confidence grew. He pointed to the colorful planets on his board, explaining facts about each one with growing enthusiasm. The class listened intently, captivated by Kennedy's presentation. Even some of the students who usually dozed off were sitting up straight, their eyes wide with interest. As Kennedy finished his presentation, the room erupted in applause. His classmates cheered, some even standing up to clap louder. Kennedy's face lit up with a bright smile, his eyes shining with pride. "That was amazing, Kennedy," one of his classmates called out. "Yeah, you really know your stuff," another added. Kennedy beamed, basking in the warmth of his classmates' approval. He looked over at Miss Rodriguez, who was clapping enthusiastically, her face glowing with pride. But as Kennedy's gaze shifted to Miss Dorothy, his smile faltered. The teacher sat at her desk, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes cold and hard. She didn't clap, didn't offer a single word of praise. Instead, she scribbled something furiously on her notepad, her pen nearly tearing through the paper. Miss Dorothy's face was a mask of bitterness and resentment. She watched as the students continued to congratulate Kennedy, their excitement palpable in the air. With each word of praise, her frown deepened, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her pen tighter. In that moment, Miss Dorothy felt her authority slipping away. She had always prided herself on being the one to shape these young minds, to determine who succeeded and who failed. But here was Kennedy, the very student she had deemed hopeless, shining brightly in front of the entire class. As the cheers finally died down and Kennedy returned to his seat, Miss Dorothy's eyes followed him. Her gaze was filled with a silent, seething anger. She watched as Miss Rodriguez gave Kennedy a discreet high five, and something inside her snapped. In that moment, Miss Dorothy made a silent vow. She would not let this stand. She would find a way to reassert her authority, to put Kennedy back in his place. The wheels in her mind began to turn, plotting her next move. The day after Kennedy's successful presentation, Miss Dorothy marched into Principal Bernard's office, her face set with grim determination. She clutched a folder tightly to her chest, knuckles white with tension. "Principal Whitmore," she said, her voice trembling with feigned concern. "I have a serious matter to discuss with you." Bernard looked up from his paperwork, his brow furrowing at Miss Dorothy's tone. "What seems to be the problem, Miss Dorothy?" She placed the folder on his desk and opened it, revealing several papers inside. "I'm afraid I've discovered something troubling about Kennedy's recent work," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I believe he's been cheating on his assignments." Bernard's eyes widened in disbelief. "That's a very serious accusation, Miss Dorothy. What evidence do you have?" Miss Dorothy pulled out several worksheets pointing to similarities in handwriting and answers. "These assignments show a sudden and dramatic improvement that's simply not possible without outside help. I suspect he's been copying from other students or getting answers from somewhere else." As Miss Dorothy continued to present her fabricated evidence, the news of the accusation spread through the school like wildfire. Teachers whispered in the hallways, and students exchanged worried glances. Meanwhile, Kennedy sat in his classroom, unaware of the storm brewing around him. He was still riding high from the success of his presentation, feeling proud and confident for the first time in months. It wasn't until lunchtime that Kennedy sensed something was wrong. His classmates, who had been so supportive just yesterday, now avoided his gaze and whispered behind their hands when he walked by. Confused and hurt, Kennedy retreated to a quiet corner of the playground. As the final bell rang, Kennedy was called to the principal's office. His heart sank as he walked down the long hallway, wondering what he could have done wrong. When he entered the office, he saw his father sitting behind the desk, his face grave. Miss Dorothy stood to the side, her eyes cold and triumphant. "Kennedy," Bernard said softly, "Miss Dorothy has brought some serious concerns to my attention. She believes you may have cheated on your recent assignments." Kennedy's world came crashing down around him. He felt his chest tighten, his breath coming in short gasps. But I didn't cheat," he stammered, tears welling up in his eyes. "I worked really hard. Miss Rodriguez helped me after school. I promise I didn't cheat." Bernard's heart broke as he watched his son's distress. He wanted nothing more than to gather Kennedy in his arms and assure him everything would be all right. But as principal, he had to remain impartial, at least for now. "We'll get to the bottom of this, Kennedy," Bernard said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "For now, I need you to go back to your classroom with Mrs. Rodriguez." As Kennedy left the office, his shoulders slumped in defeat, Bernard turned to Miss Dorothy. "We'll need to investigate these claims thoroughly," he said, his tone neutral, but his eyes sharp. Miss Dorothy nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She believed she had finally regained control, unaware that her desperate act would soon lead to her own downfall. The news of the cheating accusation against Kennedy spread quickly, reaching the ears of the school board members. Within days, a special meeting was called to address the situation. The tension in the air was thick as Bernard entered the conference room, his face a mask of calm despite the turmoil in his heart. The board members sat around a large oak table, their expressions grave. Mrs. Harris, the board president, spoke first. Principal Whitmore, we've called this meeting to discuss the serious allegations against your son, Kennedy. Bernard nodded, his voice steady. I understand the gravity of the situation, and I assure you that we're conducting a thorough investigation. Mr. Johnson, another board member, leaned forward. Bernard, we're concerned that your personal relationship with Kennedy might be affecting your judgment in this matter. Can you assure us that you're approaching this objectively? Bernard felt a pang in his chest, but he kept his composure. I appreciate your concern, he said carefully. While Kennedy is my son, I'm committed to handling this situation with the same professionalism I would apply to any student. As the meeting continued, Miss Dorothy was invited to present her case. She entered the room with an air of confidence, clutching her folder of evidence. Members of the board, she began, her voice dripping with false concern. I've been teaching for over 30 years and I've never seen such a blatant case of cheating. Kennedy's sudden improvement is simply impossible without outside help. She proceeded to show the board members the assignments she had collected, pointing out what she claimed were clear signs of cheating. It's a shame, she added, shaking her head. The boy clearly doesn't deserve the praise he's been receiving. Bernard's jaw clenched at Miss Dorothy's words, but he remained silent, knowing that any outburst would only strengthen the doubts about his objectivity. As the meeting wore on, Bernard found himself in an increasingly difficult position. He knew the truth about Kennedy's hard work and Miss Rodriguez's after-school help, but he couldn't reveal this information without seeming biased. The board members exchanged worried glances, clearly torn between their respect for Bernard and the seemingly compelling evidence presented by Miss Dorothy. Mrs. Harris sighed heavily. Principal Whitmore, we find ourselves in a delicate situation. Given your personal involvement, we believe it might be best if you recuse yourself from this investigation. Bernard felt as if the wind had been knocked out of him. He opened his mouth to protest, but Mrs. Harris held up a hand. We know this is difficult, Bernard, but we need to ensure that this matter is handled with complete impartiality. Kennedy sat on the steps outside the school, his small shoulders slumped under the weight of Miss Dorothy's accusations. The warm afternoon sun couldn't penetrate the dark cloud of sadness that hung over him. He picked at a loose thread on his backpack, tears threatening to spill from his eyes. It's not fair, he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. I worked so hard. The boy's mind raced with thoughts of the nights he'd spent practicing his reading, the extra time he'd put into his assignments. He remembered the pride he'd felt when his classmates cheered for his presentation. Now it all felt tainted by Miss Dorothy's cruel words. As Kennedy sat there feeling more alone than ever, he heard soft footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Miss Rodriguez, her kind face etched with concern. May I sit with you, Kennedy? She asked gently. Kennedy nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Miss Rodriguez lowered herself onto the step beside him, her presence warm and comforting. I heard what happened, she said softly. I want you to know that I believe in you, Kennedy. I've seen how hard you work, and I know you didn't cheat. Kennedy's lip quivered. But Miss Dorothy said, Miss Dorothy is wrong, Miss Rodriguez interrupted firmly. You are a bright, talented boy, Kennedy. Don't let anyone make you doubt that. She reached out and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Remember how well you did on your presentation? That was all you. Your hard work, your creativity, your bravery in standing up in front of the class. Kennedy felt a small spark of hope ignite in his chest. Really? Miss Rodriguez nodded, her eyes shining with sincerity. Really. And I want you to keep pushing forward, no matter how hard things get. You have so much potential, Kennedy. Don't let anyone dim your light. For the first time that day, a tiny smile tugged at the corners of Kennedy's mouth. Miss Rodriguez's words wrapped around him like a warm blanket, chasing away some of the chill left by Miss Dorothy's accusations. Thank you, Miss Rodriguez, Kennedy said softly. You're welcome, Kennedy, she replied, giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze. Remember, you're not alone in this. I'm here for you, and so are your friends and your dad. We all believe in you. As they sat there on the steps, Kennedy felt a flicker of determination growing inside him. Miss Dorothy's words still hurt, but Miss Rodriguez's faith in him gave him the strength to keep going. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but he wasn't ready to give up just yet. Bernard sat at his desk, his brow furrowed in concentration as he pored over the stack of papers before him. The soft glow of his desk lamp illuminated the testimonies he had gathered, each one a piece of evidence against Miss Dorothy's unfair treatment of students, especially Kennedy. He picked up a letter from Mrs. Johnson, a concerned parent. Her words leapt off the page. "My daughter came home crying because Miss Dorothy called her stupid in front of the entire class." Bernard's heart ached as he imagined the pain those children had endured. Next, he reviewed a statement from Mr. Willow, a fellow teacher. "I've witnessed Miss Dorothy consistently favoring certain students while being overly harsh with others, particularly those from minority backgrounds," it read. Bernard nodded grimly, knowing this pattern all too well. As he organized the documents, Bernard's mind wandered to Kennedy. The image of his son's tear-stained face after Miss Dorothy's false accusation made his chest tighten. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm and focused. "I have to do this right," he murmured to himself, "for Kennedy and for all the other kids who've suffered silently." Bernard reached for his phone and dialed Miss Rodriguez's number. When she answered, he said, "Thank you for agreeing to speak at the hearing. Your testimony about Kennedy's progress and Miss Dorothy's behavior will be crucial." After hanging up, Bernard leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He knew the upcoming confrontation with the school board would be challenging. Miss Dorothy had been at the school for years, and some board members might be reluctant to act against her. But as Bernard looked at the photo of Kennedy on his desk, his son's bright smile beaming back at him, he felt a surge of determination. He would fight this battle not just for Kennedy, but for every child who deserved a safe and nurturing learning environment. With renewed energy, Bernard turned back to his work, carefully preparing his presentation for the board. He organized the testimonies, highlighted key points, and practiced his arguments. As the night wore on, Bernard's resolve only grew stronger. "We'll get through this, Kennedy," he whispered to the photo. "I promise." The day of the school board hearing arrived, and the tension in the room was palpable. Bernard stood at the front, his posture straight and his eyes filled with determination. The board members sat behind a long table, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. "Thank you for convening this meeting," Bernard began, his voice steady. "I'm here to present evidence of a serious issue affecting our students." As Bernard laid out his case, the room grew quiet. He presented testimony after testimony, each one painting a clear picture of Miss Dorothy's unfair treatment of students, especially those from minority backgrounds. "Mrs. Johnson's daughter was called stupid in front of her classmates," Bernard said, holding up a letter. "Mr. Willow, a fellow teacher, has witnessed consistent favoritism and harsh treatment." The board members exchanged glances, their initial skepticism giving way to concern. Bernard could see their expressions changing as the weight of the evidence sank in. When he presented the false accusation against Kennedy, Bernard's voice wavered slightly. "My son was accused of cheating, despite clear evidence of his hard work and progress." Miss Rodriguez stepped forward to testify, her voice filled with passion. "I've seen Kennedy's improvement firsthand. Miss Dorothy's accusation is not only false, but harmful to a child who's trying his best." As the testimonies piled up, Miss Dorothy's face grew pale. She sat rigidly in her chair, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. When given a chance to speak, her voice trembled. I've always held my students to high standards," she stammered. "It's for their own good." But her words rang hollow in the face of overwhelming evidence. The board members' expressions had shifted from doubt to dismay. "Miss Dorothy," one board member said, his voice stern, "these accusations are extremely serious. Your initial explanation doesn't align with the evidence we've seen today." Realizing her position was crumbling, Miss Dorothy's desperation became evident. Her calm facade cracked, and she began to speak rapidly, her words tumbling over each other. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising. "These children need discipline. They need structure. Without it, they'll never succeed." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The board members looked at each other, their decision clear in their eyes. Bernard stood firm, his heart racing but his resolve unwavering. He had done it. He had exposed the truth and stood up for Kennedy and all the other students who had suffered under Miss Dorothy's unfair treatment. As the evidence mounted against her, Miss Dorothy's composure crumbled. Her face, once stern and unyielding, now crumpled with emotion. Tears welled up in her eyes, surprising everyone in the room. I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought I was doing what was best for the children, but now I see. I've lost my way." The room fell silent as Miss Dorothy stood up, her shoulders slumped. "I hereby resign from my position," she announced, her words barely above a whisper. "I'm confused about what it means to be a teacher now. I need time to reflect on these accusations and my actions." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. Bernard watched her go, a mix of emotions swirling inside him: relief, sadness, and a glimmer of hope for change. In the weeks that followed, the school began to heal. Kennedy, with the support of his father and Miss Rodriguez, started to regain his confidence. His classmates rallied around him, and slowly but surely, the wounds inflicted by Miss Dorothy began to mend. Then, one sunny afternoon, Bernard received an unexpected call. It was Miss Dorothy, asking if she could meet with him and Kennedy. Hesitant but open to the possibility of closure, Bernard agreed. They met at a quiet park near the school. Miss Dorothy looked different, softer somehow, the hard edges of her demeanor smoothed away by reflection and regret. She approached Bernard and Kennedy, who were sitting on a bench, her steps slow and uncertain. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I owe you both an apology." She knelt down in front of Kennedy, meeting his eyes. "Kennedy, I'm so sorry for how I treated you. You're a bright, wonderful boy, and I let my own fears and prejudices blind me to that. Can you ever forgive me?" Kennedy looked at her, his young face serious and thoughtful. Then, with the beautiful innocence of a child, he nodded. "I forgive you, Miss Dorothy," he said softly. Miss Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. She turned to Bernard. "Principal Whitmore. Bernard, I'm sorry for the pain I caused your son and the other students. I failed as a teacher and as a person. I'm working to be better." Bernard nodded, his own eyes misting over at the sincerity in her voice. "Thank you, Miss Dorothy. Your apology means a lot, especially to Kennedy." As they talked, the tension that had hung between them for so long began to dissipate. Kennedy's forgiveness, given so freely and purely, touched both adults deeply. It was a moment of healing, of moving forward, guided by the wisdom and strength of a child's heart. In the weeks following Miss Dorothy's resignation, Principal Bernard Whitmore set about making significant changes at the school. He knew that the incident with Kennedy had revealed deeper issues that needed addressing. With determination and compassion, he began implementing new programs to promote kindness, inclusion, and fairness throughout the school. Bernard called a staff meeting to discuss his plans. "We need to create an environment where every child feels valued and supported," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "What happened to Kennedy should never happen to any student again." The teachers nodded in agreement, many of them still processing the events of the past few weeks. Miss Rodriguez, sitting in the front row, raised her hand. "I'd like to help in any way I can," she offered, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. Bernard smiled warmly at her. "Thank you, Miss Rodriguez. Your support for Kennedy has been invaluable. I'd like you to take a leading role in these new initiatives." Over the next month, the school underwent a transformation. Colorful posters promoting kindness and inclusion adorned the hallways. Teachers received training on recognizing and addressing bias in the classroom. Students participated in workshops on empathy and understanding differences. Kennedy, once shy and withdrawn, began to blossom in this new environment. His classmates, inspired by his resilience, rallied around him. They included him in their games at recess and sought his help with schoolwork, recognizing his intelligence and gentle nature. Miss Rodriguez continued to be a guiding light for Kennedy and other students. She started an after-school mentoring program where older students could support younger ones. Kennedy, despite his young age, became an unexpected role model. "Remember how it feels when someone is kind to you," Miss Rodriguez would often say to her students. "That's how we should treat everyone, every day." The change in the school was palpable. Laughter echoed more frequently in the hallways. Students from different grades and backgrounds mingled freely. The tension that had once hung in the air like a heavy cloud had lifted, replaced by a sense of community and belonging. One afternoon, as Bernard watched the students playing happily at recess, he felt a tugging at his sleeve. He looked down to see Kennedy smiling up at him. "Dad," Kennedy said, his voice filled with a confidence that warmed Bernard's heart, "I really like our school now." Bernard knelt down, pulling his son into a tight hug. "I'm so glad, Kennedy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You helped make this happen, you know. Your strength and kindness inspired all of us." As they pulled apart, Bernard saw Miss Rodriguez approaching, a group of students trailing behind her, eager to show Kennedy a new game they had learned. As the school year drew to a close, Principal Bernard Whitmore stood at the podium during the end-of-year assembly, his heart swelling with pride. The auditorium buzzed with excitement, filled with students, teachers, and parents eagerly awaiting the special announcements. "Before we conclude this wonderful year," Bernard began, his voice warm and steady, "I'd like to recognize a student who has shown exceptional courage, resilience, and academic growth." A hush fell over the crowd as Bernard continued. "Kennedy Whitmore, would you please come up to the stage?" Kennedy's eyes widened in surprise. He looked up at Miss Rodriguez, who sat beside him, and she gave him an encouraging nod. With a deep breath, Kennedy stood and made his way to the stage, his steps growing more confident with each passing moment. As Kennedy reached the stage, Bernard placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Kennedy has faced challenges this year that would have discouraged many," Bernard said, his voice filled with emotion. "But instead of giving up, he persevered. He showed us all the power of kindness, forgiveness, and hard work." The audience listened intently, many nodding in agreement. Some of Kennedy's classmates cheered, their faces beaming with pride for their friend. "Not only has Kennedy improved academically," Bernard continued, "but he has also become a beacon of positivity in our school community. His courage has inspired changes that have made our school a better place for everyone." Bernard turned to Kennedy, presenting him with a certificate. "Kennedy, we are all so proud of you. This certificate is for outstanding achievement in academic growth and community spirit." The auditorium erupted in applause. Kennedy's face lit up with a smile that seemed to brighten the entire room. He looked out at the sea of faces all cheering for him and felt a warmth spread through his chest. As the applause died down, Kennedy spoke softly into the microphone. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I couldn't have done it without all of you, especially you, Dad." Tears glistened in Bernard's eyes as he pulled Kennedy into a tight hug. The audience let out a collective "aw," touched by the tender moment between father and son. As they stepped off the stage, Miss Rodriguez was there to greet them, her eyes shining with pride. "Kennedy," she said, kneeling down to his level, "you've shown us all what it means to be brave and kind. Never forget how special you are." Kennedy nodded, his smile unwavering. He looked around at his classmates, teachers, and his father, the people who had supported him, believed in him, and helped him grow. In that moment, surrounded by love and acceptance, Kennedy felt truly at home. The assembly concluded with a sense of joy and unity. As families began to file out of the auditorium, many stopped to congratulate Kennedy and Bernard. The school community, once divided, now stood strong and united, with father and son at the heart of this positive transformation. If you enjoyed the story of Bernard, Kennedy, and Dorothy, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.